The morning we got surrounded didn't start with gunfire. It started with fog, thick, pale, crawling fog that rolled through the forest like it had a purpose, muffling every sound and turning the world into a grey blur. I could hear my own breath inside my helmet, slow and uneven, like I was afraid even the air might give us away. We were marching through the Ardennes, what was left of us anyway, 12 men from a platoon that had started with 40. 12 faces I could never forget if I lived another 100 years. O'Malley with that nervous grin, always chewing something. Torres muttering in Spanish, half prayer, half curse. Carter with the radio slung over his shoulder, swearing at the static. Dawson, walking point, his eyes scanning every shadow as if he could see through trees. And the lieutenant, young, calm, hard as iron, but his eyes were tired. We all were. It had been weeks of freezing nights, sleepless watches, rations that tasted like cardboard, and the constant sound of artillery in the distance that reminded us we were still alive, only because the enemy hadn't decided otherwise yet. We didn't talk much. Words were heavy, and silence had become its own kind of company. The order was simple. Move east, secure the ridge, hold until reinforcements arrive. Orders are always simple until you try to follow them. The forest looked endless, every tree the same, every path swallowed by snow and mist. I remember thinking it was beautiful for a second, just a second, before the first shell hit. It came without warning, a flash of white fire and the sound of the earth splitting open. Then, another, closer, the air filled with dirt, snow, and screams. I hit the ground hard, my rifle pressed to my chest, and when I lifted my head, I saw O'Malley's helmet spinning in the air before disappearing into the fog. The ground shook like the world was cracking apart. "Ambush!" someone yelled, but it was useless. Nobody could hear over the chaos. The machine guns opened up next, a ripping mechanical sound that shredded the silence and cut through the trees. We were pinned. The bullets tore bark off the trunks, whistled past our ears, and kicked up snow that mixed with blood until I couldn't tell which was which. I remember trying to see the enemy, but all I could make out were flashes of muzzle fire, orange sparks blinking in and out like the eyes of demons in the mist. The lieutenant crawled up beside me, grabbed my shoulder, and shouted something I could barely hear over the noise. "We're surrounded." That word hit harder than any explosion. Surrounded. It meant nowhere to go, no one coming to save us, no sky big enough to run to. I looked around and realized he was right. The gunfire came from every direction. Our radio was gone. Carter hit in the first barrage. The trees were burning now, the smoke mixing with the fog, choking us. Someone screamed for a medic, but there was no reply. Dawson was dragging Torres, who was bleeding from his leg, trying to get behind a fallen log that barely offered cover. I don't remember deciding to move. I just did. Crawled through the mud, the snow, the blood, whatever it was under me. My hands were shaking so bad I could hardly reload. Every time I looked up, I saw another body drop. The world had turned into noise, light, and fear. And in the middle of it, the lieutenant was still shouting orders, still trying to make sense of madness. "Hold the line," he yelled. "Return fire." And somehow we did. We fired blind, hoping to hit anything that moved. I felt the kick of my rifle against my shoulder, smelled the cordite, saw the flash and the smoke, but I didn't even know what I was aiming at. All I knew was if I stopped shooting, I'd start thinking, and thinking would kill me faster than a bullet. After what felt like hours, but must have been minutes, the firing slowed. The air was heavy and still, filled with the sound of groaning men and crackling fire. That's when the lieutenant crawled out into the open, his sleeve soaked in blood. He looked at what was left of us, 7 men now, and said, almost quietly, "We can't stay here. We fall back." At first, nobody moved. Retreat wasn't a word we liked to hear. It meant giving ground, admitting we'd been beaten. But the look in his eyes told a different story. It wasn't fear. It was calculation, the kind that keeps you alive. "We fall back," he repeated, louder this time. "Now!" He grabbed Dawson and shoved him toward the trees. Then he looked at me. "Cover them." I nodded before my brain even caught up. I fired a few bursts into the fog, hoping it would keep their heads down long enough. Then we ran. God, we ran. Through trees, through mud, through fire. The forest felt alive, like it wanted to keep us there. Every step I took, I expected to feel a round tear through my back. The snow was red and brown beneath our boots, and I could hear men sobbing as they ran. We didn't look back. You don't look back when hell's behind you. When we finally stopped, the world was quiet again. We'd lost more men, and the ones left were too tired to even speak. We dropped where we stood, gasping, coughing, our hands frozen to our weapons. The lieutenant stood there, scanning the darkness behind us, listening for pursuit. After a moment, he lowered his rifle and said something that didn't make sense to me then, but stayed in my head forever. Sometimes, the only way to win is to live long enough to fight again. I remember staring at it, trying to understand. I do now. That retreat wasn't defeat. It was survival. It was the first step towards something we didn't yet see coming. That day, running saved us. And the next morning, when the fog lifted, I realized he'd led us straight into higher ground, into the position that would turn the tide of everything that came after. If you've stayed with me this far, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know who's out there listening, because some stories only matter when someone remembers them. The snow had stopped by dawn, but the cold stayed, clinging to our bones like it wanted to finish what the Germans had started. We huddled in the tree line, barely speaking, eyes fixed on the valley below. The lieutenant was crouched by a fallen pine, studying a rough map spread over his knee, the paper already torn and smeared with mud. His hand trembled slightly when he traced a line along the contour of the ridge, and for a moment I realized he was human, just a kid like us, scared, cold, and trying to make sense of a war that didn't make sense to anyone. The fog had thinned, revealing the faint outlines of the enemy positions we'd escaped from. I could see movement down there, dark shapes shifting, the flicker of fires, the metallic glint of helmets. They thought we were gone, wiped out. That was their first mistake. The lieutenant looked up, meeting our eyes one by one. "We're not done," he said quietly. "Not by a long shot." He tore the map in half and stuffed it in his jacket. "They'll come after us. When they do, we make them pay for every inch." We didn't question him. There was nothing left to question. Orders, faith, fear, they all blurred into the same thing. You just held on to whatever kept you standing. We started digging in, using our helmets, our hands, anything we could find. The ground was frozen, the dirt hard as stone, and every shovel of it felt like it might break us. But we worked in silence, the kind that's heavy, but focused. It wasn't hope that drove us. It was the refusal to die without taking something with us. By noon, we'd built shallow trenches along the ridge, stacked what ammo we had left, and set up a firing line that looked more desperate than defensive. Dawson scavenged extra clips from the dead we'd carried up. Torres was pale, his leg still bleeding through a bandage, but he refused to rest. He just sat there with his rifle across his knees, whispering prayers that mixed with his shivering. I remember looking at him and thinking how strange it was that prayer and bullets could coexist so easily out here. Maybe that's what war really is, faith and fear sharing the same breath. The lieutenant moved among us, checking weapons, giving quiet words that felt heavier than any sermon. He didn't yell anymore. He didn't need to. There was something in his calm that steadied us, even when the world felt like it could collapse at any second. "They think we ran," he said. "Let them think that. They'll come charging up here expecting ghosts. Let's show them what kind of ghosts we are." There was a murmur of grim laughter. I could feel the shift. The moment fear turns into something sharper. Not courage, not exactly, but something close enough to pass for it. We were done running. We didn't know it yet, but that ridge would be the place we stopped dying and started fighting again. Night fell fast. The forest grew darker, colder. I lay in the snow, my rifle against my cheek, eyes fixed on the shadows below. The moonlight made everything silver, even the bloodstains on my gloves. I could hear the wind whispering through the branches, carrying sounds that could have been footsteps or could have been my imagination. Every sense was stretched thin, waiting. Around midnight, the first shot cracked the silence. One of ours, Dawson, had spotted movement. Then came another shot, and another. The Germans were probing, testing. We stayed low, quiet, disciplined. The lieutenant's hand signal flashed down the line. "Hold fire." I could see them now, dark figures moving between trees, creeping closer, confident, unaware that we were still breathing. I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat. My finger was on the trigger. But I didn't pull, not yet, not until I saw the glint of their rifles in the moonlight. Then, when the lieutenant raised his hand and dropped it, we opened up all at once. The night exploded. Rifles barked, tracers cut through the air, men shouted in German and English, indistinguishable in the chaos. I fired until the barrel smoked, ejected the clip, slammed another in, and kept going. The first wave never stood a chance. They'd come in too close, expecting silence. We tore through them before they even knew where we were. But then came the second wave, heavier, louder. Mortars thumped in the valley. Shells whistled overhead. Trees splintered. I ducked, covering my head as snow and bark rained down. My ears rang, but I could still hear the lieutenant shouting commands, his voice the only anchor in that storm of noise. We shifted positions, fired in bursts, then fell back to reload. I caught a glimpse of Torres still firing despite the blood soaking his leg, of O'Malley tossing grenades with a grin that looked more like madness. And through it all, the ridge held. For every man we lost, we took 3 of theirs. The valley below was burning now, orange and red against the white snow. When the shooting finally stopped, the silence felt wrong again, too heavy, too complete. The lieutenant moved along the line, checking who was still breathing. 6 of us, just 6. The rest were gone. He crouched beside me, staring down at the valley, his face grey in the moonlight. "They'll come again," he said softly, "but so will we." I didn't know what he meant then, not fully. I just nodded, too tired to ask. But looking back, I understand. That night wasn't just survival, it was defiance. A retreat turned into a stand, a handful of broken men holding a hill the enemy thought they'd already won. And somewhere in that frozen silence, something inside us shifted. We weren't running anymore. We were becoming something the war couldn't break. If you've been following this story, if you've ever felt like you had to fight your way back from something that should have finished you, subscribe now. Because the battles worth telling aren't just the ones we win, but the ones we survive long enough to understand. Dawn came slow, like it was afraid to touch the world we'd made during the night. The snow was pink with blood, the trees splintered and scarred, smoke curling through the frozen air. I remember lying there in the half-light, my rifle still warm in my hands, staring at the bodies below the ridge. They looked like scattered toys from some cruel child's game, limbs twisted, helmets half buried, steam rising off their breathless chests. It didn't feel like victory, it felt like something quieter, emptier, but we were alive, and that was enough. The lieutenant was the first to move. He stood brushing snow off his coat, his eyes scanning the valley below. "They'll regroup," he said. His voice was hoarse, low but steady. "They think we're trapped up here. They'll try to box us in before noon." He turned to me. "Carter's gone, right?" I nodded. The radio operator hadn't made it through the night. "Then we make our own luck," he said. We began stripping the dead for ammo, grenades, anything useful. It wasn't cruelty, it was necessity. The war didn't leave room for sentiment. Dawson found a German machine gun half buried in the snow and dragged it to the ridge. O'Malley scrounged extra belts and stacked them like gold. Torres sat against a tree, pale but grinning through the pain, his hands shaking as he loaded another clip. "You think they'll come again?" he asked. I didn't answer. We all knew they would. You could feel it in the stillness, the tension before the storm. The lieutenant crouched beside the machine gun, sketching lines in the snow with a stick. "We let them come up the slope," he said. "Make them think we're broken. When they're halfway up, we open fire, hit them hard, then pull back again. Make them chase us. The more they move uphill, the more exposed they are." He looked at each of us. "You've got one job. Don't die until I tell you to." The plan sounded insane, but so did everything that had kept us alive so far. By mid-morning, we could hear them. Boots crunching through the snow shouted orders in German, the clatter of rifles being loaded. The lieutenant motioned for silence. We crouched low behind our line, hearts pounding so loud I was sure they could hear us. Then we saw them, dark figures moving through the smoke, cautious but confident. They thought we were dead. They thought this ridge was theirs. I waited until I could see their faces, until I could count the lines of exhaustion in their eyes. Then, the lieutenant whispered, "Now!" The machine gun roared to life. It was like the air itself exploded. Snow and dirt flew up in clouds. Men screamed and fell, the whole front line collapsing under that storm of bullets. I fired until my shoulder went numb, my vision blurred from the recoil. Grenades arced through the sky, landing in bursts of flame and snow. The enemy scattered, shouting, some firing blindly up the slope. For a few minutes, the world became nothing but sound and chaos, the kind of madness that burns into your bones. Dawson was yelling something I couldn't hear. Torres had gone quiet, his head bowed but his finger still on the trigger. Then came the mortars. They hit the slope in heavy, brutal rhythm. Each blast threw chunks of earth and snow into the air. One landed so close it lifted me off my feet and slammed me into the ground. My helmet flew off, and for a second, all I could hear was a high ringing in my ears. When I blinked the dirt out of my eyes, I saw O'Malley's position was gone, just a smoking crater where he'd been seconds before. The machine gun had fallen silent. The lieutenant was waving, shouting for us to pull back. I grabbed Torres under the arms, dragging him through the snow, both of us coughing from the smoke. We stumbled through the trees, the slope behind us collapsing under shellfire. We regrouped maybe 50 yards back, deeper in the forest. The lieutenant was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, but his eyes were alive, cold, sharp, focused. "They'll think we're retreating again," he said. "That's good. We'll let them follow. We'll make them climb right into our trap." He pointed to a ravine behind us, narrow and steep, flanked by thick trees. "That's where we end it." He handed me a grenade belt. "You and Dawson take the right flank. Wait until you see them in the open, then light them up." I nodded, though my hands were shaking. It didn't take long. The Germans came charging through the trees, shouting, thinking we were broken. They fired wild, their confidence louder than their discipline, and that's when we hit them. Rifles cracked from both sides, echoing through the ravine. Dawson lobbed grenades down the slope, the blasts rolling like thunder. I saw men drop, stumble, disappear into smoke. The lieutenant stood out in the open, firing calmly, deliberately, each shot precise. The Germans tried to push forward, but they were bottlenecked, trapped in the narrow pass. Every inch they gained cost them another man. The snow turned black with soot and red with blood. It was brutal, fast, and final. When it was over, the only sound left was the wind. The ravine was littered with broken helmets, torn uniform, and silence. I sat down hard, too tired to even feel relief. My hands were raw, my throat burned from breathing smoke. Dawson dropped beside me, grinning like a madman. "We did it," he said, voice hoarse. "We actually did it." I wanted to believe. The lieutenant walked past us, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. He didn't smile. He just stared at the bodies below and said, "No, we survived. That's not the same thing." Then he sat, rubbing his hands together, staring off into the trees as if he could already see the next fight coming. We spent the rest of that day burying our dead, or at least the ones we could reach. The forest was quiet, but not peaceful, the kind of quiet that hums with everything unsaid. As the sun dipped low, painting the snow orange, the lieutenant gathered us, 5 of us now, from 12. "We've hurt them bad," he said, "but they'll come again, and this time they'll bring more." He looked at me. "You've still got the map?" I nodded. "Good. We move tonight. There's a supply road north of here. If we can take it before dawn, we can cut off their reinforcements." His words sounded impossible, but then again, everything we'd done so far had been impossible. That night, we packed what we could carry and left the ridge behind. I looked back once, at the smoking trees and the frozen valley below. It didn't look like a place where anyone had won, just a graveyard carved into the snow. But it was ours. It was where we stopped dying and started fighting back. And for the first time since landing in Europe, I felt something like belief, not in victory, not in glory, but in each other. You ever been pushed so far you had to lose everything before you learned how to fight? Tell me in the comments, what was the hardest battle you ever had to crawl back from? Copy and paste this if you've ever been surrounded and kept fighting anyway. I've been there, and I made it out. The night we moved on the supply road felt like stepping into the belly of a sleeping animal, quiet, but full of breath and the promise of waking. We left the ridge under a moon that hid behind thin clouds, everything washed in the grey light that makes shadows soft and mistakes easy to miss. Our boots crunched on frozen leaves. Every sound felt loud enough to tell the enemy where we were. The lieutenant walked ahead with that same careful, terrible calm he'd carried since the ambush, his jaw set like a man carving a plan out of cold stone. We were 5, me, Dawson, Torres, O'Malley, and him, and the weight of the 12 we'd been clung to us like a second uniform. We moved light, no heavy pack, only what we could sling and fire. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. Hit the supply convoy before dawn, cut off their reinforcements, and disappear into the trees before they could organize a counter. If it worked, it might change everything. If it failed, there'd be nothing left to change. There wasn't much room for hope in that equation, but there was room for resolve. We crept down into the fold of the land, where the road dipped, and a stand of bare trees gave us cover. From up close, the convoy looked smaller than I'd imagined. 2 trucks, a staff car, and a half-track, the engines idling like beasts waiting to be fed. There were maybe 20 men stepping around, laughing low, the sound of cigarettes and crude jokes drifting through the cold. They were careless. They had no reason to expect ghosts in their own supply lane. The lieutenant counted them in the dim, then pointed where we should plant the charges Dawson had jury-rigged from our salvaged explosives, and the German sticks of TNT O'Malley had found in a knocked-over crate. We worked like surgeons with trembling hands, wrapping wires, burying slivers of metal in snow, setting timers with a meticulousness that felt almost obscene given the hour. Every move was measured because there was nothing to spare. Dawson's fingers were numb but steady. Torres hummed a small hymn under his breath that steadied our breath as much as the cold did. When the devices were set, the lieutenant whispered instructions. I'd take the left flank and pin any sentry. O'Malley and Torres would be ready with grenades if things went south. Dawson would handle the charge triggers. The lieutenant himself would move the half-track and staff car, creating the choke point we needed so the convoy couldn't simply drive away. It was dangerous, calculated, and the kind of plan you only make when you understand how thin you and your luck really are. The first man I took down was younger than me, laughing at something his buddy had said until my barrel found his side, and he folded like a puppet whose strings were suddenly cut. I didn't have time to register guilt. The training rinses that stuff out with necessity. Only the burning heat of adrenaline and the mechanical repetition of action. We moved like a single thought, silent, precise. The lieutenant's hand signal was a ghost of motion, and the convoy began to crumble. Dawson's charges turned 2 of the vehicles into fireballs, steel hissing, rubber exploding. The night split open by noise. The half-track tried to reverse, but the lieutenant had already blocked the road, an iron silhouette firing into the chaos. Men shouted, alarms bellowed. The world became an orchestra of shouts, rolling flames, and the rattle of small arms. We had them on the ropes for a breath, the kind of breath that hangs between victory and a fall, and we took it. What followed was less heroics than a grind. The enemy reacted faster than we'd hoped, organizing layers of defense, men firing from the sides of trees, from behind the wreckage. The diesel smoke made the air thick and hot, an odd thing in a winter forest, and every step forward felt like wading through a furnace. O'Malley lobbed a grenade that cleared a nest of riflemen, shouting like a madman when it found its mark. Torres kept his bleeding leg hidden and kept shooting, each round carved out of effort and a refusal to let the ground take him. I remember the lieutenant stepping into a flare of light to take down a German officer who had raised his head to give an order. The officer slid down the back of a burning truck like a marionette with his strings burnt. We moved vehicle to vehicle, clearing, securing, each action precise because there was no margin left for error. It was dirty work, pulling men from behind shattered windshields, dragging the wounded into hollows, yanking bundles of ammunition away from crawling hands. We were survivors in the most literal sense, harvesting what the enemy had lost and turning it against them. At one point, the convoy's commander made a mistake that saved our skins. He sent a runner back instead of forward, a foolish human error that bought us time. Dawson heard the runner and signaled. We cut him down before he could deliver the call, and with that silence, we owned the road for the hours it took to cut every radio, torch every crate of munitions, and spike the tires on what little could still roll. The half-track, stripped of function, became our altar. We dragged enough supplies to feed the company that would later arrive in support. We stole maps and orders that gave the lieutenant insight into where the enemy thought our front would crumble next. It was incredible what paper could do, how a lost notebook could redraw battle lines in a soldier's head. We were thieves dressed in valor, scavengers who knew that the difference between living and dying might be hidden in a stamped envelope, but the cost was heavy and immediate. The firing had drawn a response. Troops from the nearest outpost. They came in like a tide, pouring through the trees with bayonets gleaming, voices raised high and harsh. We fell back at the lieutenant's signal, a controlled withdrawal that would have seemed suicidal if you'd seen it from the outside, but was, in truth, the only way we could live to fight again. We left behind men whose faces are forever etched in the black of my memory. Grief is not a bell you can unring in war. We pulled into a ravine cut deep by a stream, blood mixing with the melting snow, hands numb, but not from cold. The lieutenant had us set a rearguard ambush, me and Dawson to the flank, O'Malley and Torres closer in, so that the pursuing units would think the road was still thick with resistance. It bought the convoy's remnants and our battered unit the minutes we needed to slip away. When the sun bled through the bare trees, painting the world in the kind of light that shows every bruise, we were crouched in a ditch, with the prize of the convoy stowed near enough to touch. We'd taken food, ammo, a case of radio tubes, and a map with lines that would let us redirect the next column into an area the lieutenant had eyed earlier, a narrow valley where we could force a decisive engagement. We were 2 men short from the night's beginning, and 3 short from the men who'd been with us before the ambush. The lieutenant sat with his head in his hands for a long while, and when he looked up, there was a softness I hadn't seen before. "We did what we had to," he said. That line is simple and true in war and ugly for the ways it asks you to justify what you've done. We all owned those choices. We also owned the fact that the convoy raid had changed the map. Supplies were a heartbeat of any army. Cut that heartbeat, and you starve the beast. We moved north on the stolen maps, the tires of our luck still warm behind us, carrying the dead in the fringe of thought. The lieutenant's plan was no longer just to survive, but to set conditions for a larger maneuver, one that would trap a regimental detachment that had been thundering down the supply lines, expecting easy victory. He drew it like a man whose hands remembered the land in code, where to hold, where to bait, where to let them think they had the advantage. That night, after we'd eaten ration tins warmed over a small fire, after we'd wrapped wounds the best we could and given the dead a place to be counted, there was a moment when I sat with Torres and O'Malley and the lieutenant, and we laughed briefly about nothing at all, a brittle sound that broke like glass and somehow made us all human again. It was the smallest miracle among so many losses. When the lieutenant finally said, "Tomorrow, we finish it," there was no bravado in his voice, only resolve. I believed him because he had shown me how maddeningly stubborn a man could be with a hill and a handful of bullets. If you ever find yourself backed into a corner so tight you think the only way out is to stop breathing, what would you risk to get back up? Tell me below, and if you want something to paste as your answer, copy this. I was surrounded, and I fought my way out. By the time the sun climbed over the treetops that next morning, the air was thick with the smell of burned fuel and cordite. We were ghosts moving through the smoke of our own destruction, following a plan that felt too fragile to believe in and too necessary to doubt. The lieutenant led from the front, a map folded tight in his fist, his eyes fixed on something invisible beyond the trees. He'd pieced it all together from what we'd stolen, the routes, the schedules, the enemy's blind spots. They'd send another column to investigate the destroyed convoy. They'd assume it was a small raiding party, maybe remnants of our company. They'd come down the same road, confident, predictable, and when they did, we'd be waiting, not hiding, not running, waiting. That was the difference now. We weren't prey anymore. We were the trap. We spent the day digging into the hills north of the road, setting up in a narrow pass the lieutenant called the Bottle. It wasn't on any map. The road curved between two ridges before flattening out toward a frozen creek, with thick trees on either side, and no way to maneuver once inside. Perfect for an ambush. The lieutenant had a plan so ruthless it almost scared me. We'd plant the remaining explosives at both ends of the pass, creating choke points that could turn trucks into coffins. Dawson rigged what little TNT we had left, his hands black with grease, his movements careful, reverent even. Torres laid tripwires along the slope, every pull a whisper against the snow. O'Malley, tired but grinning, scouted the far ridge with binoculars he'd pried from a dead officer, muttering updates in that half-mad humour of his. "Looks like Christmas," he said. "All we're missing is the gifts." The lieutenant didn't laugh. None of us really did. We knew what the gifts would be. As the day stretched thin, we crouched behind our makeshift barricades, listening. The forest was unnaturally still again, the kind of silence that makes you feel like the earth itself is holding its breath. My nerves were electric. Every creak of a tree sounded like boots, every gust of wind like a whisper of death coming closer. I thought about the faces of the men we'd lost, the ones who should have been there beside us. War has a way of reducing the living to names and the dead to ghosts that never leave your head. I wondered if they were watching, if they cared that we were about to finish what they died for. Around dusk, we heard it, the distant growl of engines, heavy, slow. The lieutenant's eyes flicked up. "Positions," he said. 2 syllables, calm, final. My heart started hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The convoy rolled into view through the haze. A column of trucks, maybe 15 vehicles flanked by 2 armoured cars. Soldiers rode on the sides, rifles slung lazily, unaware they were already dead men. We let them come deep into the pass, the road crunching under their tires. The lieutenant waited until the first truck hit the centre mark, then raised his hand. The world paused, then he dropped it. Dawson hit the trigger, and the first explosion ripped through the front of the column. The blast lifted the lead truck off the ground, flipping it sideways, fire blooming into the sky like some angry god had slammed his fist into the earth. The men behind panicked, shouting, scrambling to get out. Before they could react, the second explosion sealed the back of the pass. They were trapped. That's when we opened fire. Every rifle barked in unison, echoing through the valley. The Germans tried to form up, but they had nowhere to go. We raked the trucks, cut down the gunners, picked off anyone who tried to run. It wasn't bravery, it was math. We had the angle, the surprise, and the fury of men who'd lost everything. The machine gun from the ridge poured fire down like rain, cutting through uniforms and smoke. Torres, limping, reloaded for me between shots, his breath coming out in ragged clouds. O'Malley threw grenades into the wreckage, laughing under his breath every time one went off. The lieutenant moved like he was part of the terrain itself, his rifle steady, his commands short and surgical. It was chaos turned into rhythm, violence choreographed by survival. They fought back. Desperation makes animals out of men. A handful of them managed to set up a defense behind a flipped truck, firing bursts that tore through the branches above our. A bullet clipped my helmet and spun me sideways. For a heartbeat, I saw nothing but white. When my vision cleared, I saw Torres lying face down, motionless. I crawled to him, shaking his shoulder, but his eyes were open, glassy, empty. I didn't have time to mourn. Dawson shouted that the right flank was advancing, and the lieutenant's voice cut through everything. "Hold the line." We did. For hours that felt like days, until the last rifle went silent and the fire burned low. When it was over, the pass was a graveyard. The smoke hung thick. The air stank of diesel and flesh. The snow, once white, was grey and red and black. We'd annihilated. Not a single truck made it out. The road was theirs no longer. The lieutenant stood among the wreckage, his face smeared with soot, his breath ragged but controlled. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, "We hold this ground until command finds us." I looked around at the ruins and wondered who command even was anymore. But the radio we'd taken from the convoy was intact, and for the first time in days, a voice came through. American, crackling through the static. "Echo team, confirm position, reinforcements en route." The lieutenant's jaw clenched. About damn time. That night, as we waited for relief, we built a small fire behind the ridge. None of us spoke much. We didn't have to. The silence between us said more than words could. I thought about Torres, about O'Malley's laughter, about Dawson staring blankly into the flames like he was trying to burn the memories away. I thought about the lieutenant, who sat apart from us, cleaning his rifle like it was a ritual. When he finally looked up, he met my eyes and said, "You see what retreat really means now?" I nodded. "It's not running," he said. "It's repositioning. It's surviving long enough to take back what's yours." Now then he stood, his silhouette framed by the firelight, and added, "Tomorrow we start moving again. You ever had to step back just to hit harder later? Drop a comment if you know that kind of fight. Write this if you do. Sometimes retreat is the first move toward winning." Linking up with our people was supposed to feel like salvation, but the first thing that hit me was noise. Boots, engines, shouted names that sounded like someone ripping a scar open and then slapping a bandage on it. The relief column came through the trees like a river of green and brown, faces young and not so young, rifles slung but not quite at ease, radios barking like angry birds. The lieutenant walked out to meet them with his chest puffed and a map clutched like scripture. The sergeant from the relief broke his hand in a grip that was more question than greeting, eyes scanning the wreckage behind us, as if looking for ghosts he'd been told about in rumour. We were filthy, hungry, and stitched with exhaustion. And yet when their medics moved in, and the supply sergeant passed around canned peaches like some obscene feast, I felt the lightness of hope, like a physical thing pressing my ribs outward. Men who had been a list of names and vacant spaces for days were suddenly being tended to. Someone wrapped Torres's leg properly. Someone else put a blanket over a face that no longer breathed. They called the wounded by their first names and their ranks with the same clipped tone, as if that could patch what had been done. The lieutenant briefed the company commander in low, sharp bursts, pointing out the burned column, the cratered road, the pass we'd held. He spoke like a man reading from the ledger of what had to be owed back to us. Supplies, reinforcements, recognition. The commander listened, nodding the way men nod at things that cannot be changed. Then he folded a map, handed it back, and said there would be an extraction point in 48 hours. Replacements coming through when the route was secure. 48 hours is a long time to sit with what you've done and what you didn't do. The first night with reinforcements around us, sleep came like a rumour. I lay on my back, looking at stars that could have been the same ones over any other place on Earth, and every one of them seemed suddenly too distant to be of any use. The medic had given me some morphine for the shoulder that burned like it had been rubbed raw. It smoothed the edges, but it didn't touch the weight. Around me, the new soldiers talked loudly to fill the silence. Where they were from, how long they'd been in the line, and their jokes had the forced hollowness of men trying to pretend the world wasn't a whole. The lieutenant sat a little apart, cleaning his rifle like a man who could sterilize memory with ritual. Once, when he thought no one was listening, he muttered the name of a man who died with a cigarette still between his fingers, and then pressed his palms against his face. I realized then that command is a lonely thing. It asks you to decide which lives to risk, and which losses you'll carry like ballast. I wanted to reach over and put a hand on his shoulder, in the way boys do to stop a fall. But we both knew that gesture would be a lie as much as a comfort. The papers they brought from headquarters called the action a raid, and later a delaying action. The men in the mess tent called it a miracle. Those words made the wound itch but didn't heal it. They awarded medals in the field that afternoon. Small glints taped to collars like peasants being given a coin for a bleeding. The lieutenant refused the first medal. He took it only after the captain insisted. He accepted the medal with a face that made me think of him sitting alone years from now, polishing it until it reflected nothing but his own eyes. We were photographed holding what remained of the ridge, smiles that were mostly survival, not joy. And the company clerk wrote down our names and the names of those who were gone. That list was the thing that kept the dead from evaporating into rumour. It made their loss official, which was a small mercy and a poor substitute. There is a peculiar kind of guilt that comes with surviving while others do not. It crawled into nights and whispered. I found myself replaying every second. Why had I fired there and not there? Why had I pulled back when I had? Why had I not dragged one more man into the trees? My hands developed a habit. When I slept, they would clench as if around a rifle, then uncurl as if remembering that the weapon was depleted and the dead were not. Dawson stared at the fire for an hour without blinking, and when I asked what he saw, he told me he could still hear a laugh that wasn't there anymore. O'Malley drank too much and then laughed too loud at nothing, a sound that broke into pieces when anyone looked his way. Torres, God! Torres kept asking for a pen and a piece of paper, and would write letters he never gave to anyone, folding them neatly and slipping them into a pocket that would later be found empty. We had scars you could stitch, and scars that lived like small animals under the ribs, gnawing at sleep. The lieutenant held formation drills the second day, the little mechanical motions that turned scattered men into a functioning unit. It was as if he was trying to prove to himself that the battlefield was not some random wound, but a place where order could be placed like bricks. He walked the line, corrected stances, shouted a cadence, and for a sliver of time we were soldiers again, coherent, purposeful. After the drill, he pulled me aside and asked me to help him brief the newcomers on the terrain and the tactics that had worked. He didn't say it, but the look in his eyes said that he trusted the memory of what we'd done, our hard lessons, as currency. I told him I'd help. Teaching felt like an act of redemption, like passing a candle to someone in a dark room. Maybe it was selfish, maybe it was sanity. When the chaplain came through, he walked slowly, touching shoulders and murmuring small necessary prayers. And when he bent over the graves we dug, there was a quiet I'd never heard before. He read names aloud, and the sound of each one hung in the cold like a bell. I lit a cigarette that day, though I'd sworn them off 100 times. Smoke lined my mouth and tasted of iron and ash. The chaplain put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You did right." It was not the absolution I wanted. It was as much a balm to him as to me. I wanted to tell him I had failed men who'd trusted me to be brave only in the ways that mattered. I wanted to tell him that I'd seen a look in the lieutenant's eyes that morning that made me think he believed men were numbers on a ledger. Instead, I nodded because words were spent and there was nothing left. We moved out 3 days later with fresh faces and heavy packs, the wounded patched where they could be, the dead wrapped and labelled. The lieutenant walked at the head of the column, and for the first time since the ambush, I felt something in his stride that was less like armour and more like a burden accepted. As we left the hollow where we'd buried our men, I looked back once at the small white markers and promised something I couldn't later define. For now, it was enough to carry the promise like a hot coal in my palm, painful, warming, impossible to ignore. Years later, when the war was already history printed in books and whispered about at bar counters by men who hadn't been there, I still caught myself waking to the sound of that morning's the forest, the snow, the low hum before the first shot. It stayed inside me like something unfinished. I carried it home the way you carry a scar you don't show anyone, under the sleeve, under the skin, waiting. The papers called it a small engagement in the Ardennes. They gave it dates, coordinates, statistics, and said we had turned a retreat into a local victory that helped stabilize the sector. That was the language of men who counted wars in lines and arrows. For me, it was the sound of boots in snow, the smell of smoke, the faces of 12 that became 5 and then 4, and then just the memory of them all. They were not coordinates, they were the world entire. When we finally left that place, when trucks came, and we were lifted back into the machinery of war, it didn't feel like movement forward. It felt like we'd been exhaled. We rode through towns turned to bone, civilians watching from doorways, faces pale and tight, their eyes catching the glint of our medals and then moving away. There was no triumph in it. The lieutenant sat beside me, helmet in his lap, looking straight ahead. He had become quieter as the front lines shifted east, quieter still, when he learned we'd be redeployed. At one stop, he turned to me and said, "We won something back there, didn't we?" I told him yes, but the word felt heavy. "Then why does it feel like I left myself there?" he asked. I had no answer. Sometimes the things you win in war are the same things you can't bring home. In the months that followed, we fought other battles, smaller, larger, all blurring into the same endless push. But that ridge, that pass, those men, they remained the hinge on which the rest of my life turned. After the armistice, I came home to a country that was loud and bright and full of people who wanted stories. They wanted victory speeches, tales of courage and glory. I tried to give them something they could hold on to, but every time I opened my mouth, the truth felt too raw to shape into words that wouldn't cut them. You can't explain what it means to watch a man you joked with for cold rations vanish in front of you and still keep walking. You can't tell them that sometimes bravery isn't standing your ground, but listening to an order that sounds like surrender and finding life inside it. The lieutenant wrote to me once after the war. He said he'd settled near the coast, worked on fishing boats, still woke up at 4 because his body didn't know how to rest. He ended the letter with, "We did our job. That's all it ever was." But I knew he didn't believe it. None of us did. I went back once, years later, when Europe had rebuilt itself into something cleaner, quieter, polite. The ridge was overgrown. Trees had taken back what shellfire had torn apart. The road we'd fought for was paved now, cars rolling over it like nothing had ever happened there. I stood at the spot where the lieutenant had first told us to fall back and could almost hear his voice again, low and steady through the static. The air smelled of pine instead of smoke. Somewhere a child laughed. For a moment, I let myself believe that maybe that was the victory, that the world had found a way to keep turning despite the things we'd done to it. I bent down, pressed my hand to the ground, and said their names. Every one of them, out loud. The forest didn't answer, but it didn't have to. Sometimes people ask me if I'd do it again, if it was worth it. I tell them yes, but not because of flags or medals or headline. I'd do it again because of the men beside me, the ones who laughed when there was nothing funny, who ran through fire so someone else could live, who followed an order that made no sense and found meaning in surviving it. The retreat that day wasn't the end of courage. It was the shape courage had to take to keep existing. And when I think about victory now, I don't see explosions or parades. I see 5 men in a frozen forest, moving backward so the rest of the army could move forward. I see the lieutenant's face, lit by firelight as he said, "We'll win this fight, but not here." He was right. We won it by walking away from death long enough to face it again on our terms. So if you're listening to this, and you've ever had to pull back when everything in you wanted to stand and fight, if you've ever stepped away just so you could come back stronger, then you already know what that retreat felt like. You already know what it means to lose everything and still not be defeated. So do me a favor, leave a like, share this with someone who's fought their own kind of battle, and subscribe if you want to keep hearing these stories. Because war ends, but the fight to understand it never really does. And maybe remembering is the only way we ever win for good.